Hello, my name is Danny Dorling and I want to talk to you for about 20 minutes about a book called Slowdown, The End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's a Good Thing. Here's an abstract of what I'm going to talk about. I look at lots of data in the world and I have tried to measure the speed of change in many things. I began this book thinking that we were at a time of acceleration, and the question is what was speeding up fast and what was not speeding up quite as quickly. But the reason the book is called Slowdown is after several years of measuring many things, our economy, our society, our demography and so on, globally and for different countries, I came to the conclusion that actually what was really interesting was a slowdown. And this was all before the pandemic began. That's the cover of the paperback, and I'll try and remember to explain at the end about sandcastles and slowing down. Here's a graph. It's a familiar graph. It's a graph of population numbers, human population numbers on the planet, and how that's changed over a millennium. And it's a kind of ski slope graph. It's the graph that makes you think that the end is nigh, that we can't possibly carry on like this. It's a graph that geographers often show their pupils in schools or in universities, their students. It suggests that we have a population explosion and we don't know what's going to happen next. And it leads to people making statements about how terrible the situation is. I'll give you one example of this. The current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, writing in just 13 years ago, saying the world's population is now 6.7 billion at that time, roughly double what it was when he was born. If I live to be in my mid-80s, then it will have trebled in my lifetime. I simply cannot understand why no one discusses this impending calamity, and why no world statesman has it in their guts to treat the issue with the seriousness it deserves. Now, clearly, Boris Johnson did his bit for increasing more population, but is it accelerating that fast, as he implies? The numbers are right, but is that actually a speeding up? Let's have a look. Now, what I do in Slowdown is I draw graphs in a different way. Instead of having time on the x-axis, I show the speed of change on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, I show the thing you're measuring. So here is an example of a country in which population numbers are going up and up and up in absolute terms, faster and faster and faster. The growth is actually 2% a year, but obviously 2% of a larger thing is bigger than 2% of a smaller thing. And so you can see that by the year 2000, it's just under 300 million people. By 2010, we're looking at 370,000, 370 million, and by 2020, 400 million. And as those dots get bigger and the gaps between them get wider, the population growth, the acceleration becomes obvious. And this is the kind of thing I think that Boris Johnson was thinking about in 2007. It's the kind of thing people have been talking about for a long time. Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species talks about how every so often the species can have a few favourable seasons and see a growth in its numbers. And this happened to human beings about the time that he was writing that. So that's what an acceleration looks like. Not exponential growth, not the percentage actually rising bigger and bigger itself, but certainly a growth. And here is what a deceleration looks like. Again, we're starting with a country with 100 million people, again a population growth of 2% in 1950, but then we reduce it to 1.9% in 1951, 1.8% in 1952 and so on, so that by 1970 the growth is zero. By 1971 it's reducing by 0.1% and actually only takes to 2070 for the entire population of that country to go to essentially zero, having started off at 100 million people just 120 years earlier. So I'm trying to show you what these graphs, the shapes they kind of have at the extremes. But what you want to do is to see some real data, I think, by this. So here you are. Here's some real data. Not on population, we'll come to that in a minute, but on something that was certainly accelerating, which is still rising. And this is a frequent pattern that I found when looking at different data sets. This is student debt in the United States of America. The data series begins in 2006, measured the same way from then onwards. It's measured every quarter. And if you look at 2006, 2007, 2008, you can see it veering off to the right as it not only rises, but rises by more each year than the year before, peaking in 2009 July at the speed of growth, still growing after then. Student debt in America still growing, but beginning to lean to the left. Deceleration, growing slightly less each year than the year before. The reason, by the way, that it bounces out to the right each October generally is that that's when the new students start their courses in the USA. So here's something, first example of something that you might have thought was speeding up out of control, and there's often talked about that, but actually the direction of travel changed around the time of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Still isn't under control, it's still a ridiculous amount of money, but things that rise very quickly do not carry on rising very quickly forever. They cannot do that. So that's US student debt. Let's take a different example. Wikipedia. Wikipedia began about 2001, very good idea. And the number of entries from Wikipedia accelerated every year after that to 2007. Carried on rising after 2007, but with not as many entries being added each year as had been added in 2007. There's little rise again in 2015 when people added stubs to Wikipedia. That's kind of subheadings as entries, but of course there's a limit to how many things you actually want to put into Wikipedia, how many things people are likely to look up, the enthusiasm of people who enter things into Wikipedia. And you can see this thing for big data in general. I just happen to pick Wikipedia as one of the best sources of data in this area. I'm going to zoom forward. Got quite a lot of slides to show you. Not everything slows down. This is carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, billions of tons of CO2 a year. And you can see it slowing down in the recessions, the early 80s, early 90s recessions, and slows down also around about 2008 financial crash. But in general, it's leaning slightly to the right. So you're actually getting not just growing emissions, but emissions growing slightly more each year than the year before on average. That's the first of 4 accelerations that I found in the things that I measured. I tried to measure many, many, many things. Also note that after climate change agreements, such as the Paris one, but also Kyoto and Rio are there, we've tended to have an acceleration in emissions from after the deceleration. May not be linked, may simply be coincidence. There's what the emissions graph looks like when drawn normally. This is figure 15. And what you see when you draw it in a normal way is that all that nuance of actual slight reductions, a slowing down, a speeding up at the moment in the early 2000s, it's very hard to see that because it's reduced by an order of magnitude within the graph. So what I'm doing in these different ways of showing things in the slowdown graphs is emphasizing those slight changes because we're interested in the speed of change as much as the level that we've actually got to. But if you wondered what a normal graph looks like, looking at emissions, far more simple and tells you the really basic thing that we're emitting over 35 billion tons of carbon a year, far, far too much. But it doesn't give you an idea that easily of the possibilities of change or the instability in that growth. It doesn't allow you to highlight areas like the early 1980s, early 1990s, and see how recessions in particular had a big effect on emissions. Here's the second thing, which is accelerating, although again, very, very complicated when you draw it in this way. And this is average global temperature. It's a NASA temperature series. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that you begin to get clear growth increasing generally, again, apart from the economic recessions, and then zooming up 2018, 2019. Now we know we're going to get another slowdown in this with 2020, but in general, temperature growth follows emissions growth, and it's pretty linear. So 2 things not slowing down. I'm going to go forward again because I don't want to run out of time. Population, very, very different. Now this is the equivalent of that runaway train ski slope graph, but drawn in a different way. And you draw it this way and you actually see that by 1980, the growth is beginning to, first of all, plateau, and then after 2020, you see fewer and fewer people net added to global population until sometime around about 2100, maybe earlier, because these are estimates from the UN that have been revised, and the slowdown is actually faster than is what is shown here, currently predicted slowdown. Very different pattern to the pattern you see if you put time along the horizontal axis. And something quite remarkable is happening right now in terms of more population. Let's just draw this graph a slightly different way. Let's put a log scale on the x and the y axes. So now we're emphasizing the changes when the numbers were very small. And why do that? Well, partly because it's very interesting. This is a neat summary of global population change in human beings over the last 2,000 years. Of course, the data in the distant past is not very good, but anyway, we begin in the year 1. We have growth. It's not huge, but it's accelerating, and then it slows down suddenly, now about 1500 to 1600, because that's when we went to the Americas and took our diseases to the Americas. Then slows down again 1820 to 1850. That is imperialism, colonialism, invading of many countries and things like slave trade. Then it slows down after 2020. That is very different. It is not disease, it is not war, that is control of our own fertility, it is contraception, education of women, going to university, all kinds of things that lead to an enormous change in the trajectory of population and the slowdown to come. But a summary of 2,000 years in this one graph. And these predictions aren't somebody simply putting their sort of finger in the air and having a guess. This is based on how people have been behaving for the last 30, 40, 50 years. Here's the data just for China. China matters in this because obviously it's a large country, but as you'll see in a minute, we don't depend on China for seeing this message. And again, starting 2,000 years ago, you can see the rise in population, several millions. This is the time of the Opium Wars. The British really did affect things in many other countries. The speed up before the one-child policy, then a bit of a slowdown with the one-child policy, but then even when the one-child policy is abolished, no sign of any increase in people's wish to have more children, and then from 2030 a maximum and a rapid drop down to 1 billion people in just 79 years from now. That's China. Here's the whole of the African continent all put together. This is the area of the world which has the highest predicted population growth, but again, even now by 2060, we see the rate of that growth projected to be slowing, and it may be faster than that. And I'm going to go forward just to do a whistle-stop tour around other parts of the world. India, not a dissimilar picture to China, but in this case, population growth, the rate of growth peaked 21 years ago, and population numbers are projected to peak 2064. This isn't just India, it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the whole of the India subcontinent added together, and then the decline from 2064 to 2100, and probably a decline after that. That's enough about population. Let's look at world GDP per capita, economic growth. And you can look at this graph and you may say, well, that's bending towards the right, that's acceleration of GDP growth. But we're not really looking at it the right way. Even hit there, though, you can see that huge drop to 2008 and kind of moving to the left after 2006. And of course, once we get 2020, we'll see that go way off over to the left with the biggest recession by far that we've ever seen. But again, look at this a slightly different way, because really with GDP, you want to compare a change from 1,000 to 2,000 is the same as a change from 2,000 to 4,000. A doubling is equal. So let's use log scales again. And when we use log scales of GDP growth, what we actually find is that the peak growth was around about 1950, or you could argue and say 1964. But after that, the rate of growth leans towards the left. As percentage growth, it is less and less each decade than the decade before. We tend to have our attention drawn to particular events, the crash of 2008, the growth that happened afterwards, the slowdown 2015 and so on. We don't tend to step back and look at the overall pattern. And it's the overall pattern which suggests really is pretty strong evidence for slowdown in things like economic growth, decade on decade on decade, since actually we measured GDP, which really was only accurately since the Second World War. China, the part of the world with some of the strongest growth in GDP. Even in China, the growth was slowing down after 2010, 11 years ago. Little speed up for 2017, slow down again. China's just going to about manage, I think, this year 2% GDP growth with the global recession. That brings it way over near to that line, if not below. Stock markets. Here's the Nasdaq, which is the high-tech kind of stock, and you can see incredible kind of looping and unpredictability in the 80s, and then it begins to zoom out to the right, and you can make an absolute fortune if you invest in the Nasdaq in the early 90s. Your money just goes up and up and up through to 1996. That's zooming in. We're going to zoom out now and bring in more recent years after 96, and what we get here is this incredible looping. This is the dot-com crash. It's a bit like a roller coaster. You can see it goes down 2001, 2002, around once, appears to recover 2003, 2004, 2005, and then it drops down 2008, round again, up again. Looks like it's going to do it in 2015, but doesn't. Another recovery comes up again, and then it looks like, oh, we can tell what's going to happen in 2019. It's going to shoot down. Well, it didn't, because this includes Apple, Netflix, Facebook. Did very well after the pandemic. Right? These graphs don't let you predict the future, but they just do let you look at the past in a different way. And you can look at many different things in this way. Here's adult heights, the average height of human beings, which was going up fastest over a century ago. And then the average height of people began to slow down because the great gains we were making, but better health and nutrition reduced. Now, don't worry about it actually falling. The only reason the average height of people in the world is falling is we're getting a different mix of people in the world, and people from places where they tend to be shorter. There's more people, and there's fewer people from the places where people tend to be taller most recently. But again, this is suggesting a kind of stability. Human beings change greatly, including in terms of our bodies, in recent centuries and decades, and that rate of change is not continuing now. I showed you that our emissions are still accelerating and our temperature of the planet's accelerating. Here's the third thing that I found to still be accelerating: number of graduates worldwide. And it's a quite crude measure, but an international measure of graduates, not just rising each year, but heading over to a third of all young people going to something resembling a university by 2014. But clearly that has to slow down because you can only get to 100% of young people. I thought I'd show you the third thing that's still accelerating. Interestingly, you may say, oh, the extinction of species, biodiversity loss, that's getting worse and worse and accelerating. Well, it was in the 70s and 80s, but then it began to actually slow down the rate at which we lost species. We still end up around about, 2013, having lost 70% of all large animal species, but it slowed down. And it slowed down mainly because early on, it was the really rare species that went on small islands in the 80s and 70s. If it hadn't slowed down, it wouldn't be at 70%, it would be 100%, and it would include us. It's just a different way of looking at things. Our fourth and final aspect of life that's still accelerating, or was, the number of flights that people are taking a year. But this isn't the number of people flying, it's the number of flights people are taking. There are a small number of people who fly many, many times, and the vast majority of people in the world never fly. But if you look after 2011, 2012, it was rising by more each year. A year 2017 looked to be completely out of control. That will, of course, have utterly collapsed in the last year, and I would be surprised if it gets back in a hurry to 2017 levels. So many of those flights were unnecessary. So many of those flights were only possible because so many other people were flying that you could bring down the unit cost of a flight. If we're lucky, that situation will not return in too much of a hurry, not least because of the pollution caused by those planes. Coming towards the end now, this figure 63 from the book on the absolute number of babies being born each year in the world, just to sort of show you how incredible the patterns are. The reason they loop like this are baby booms. We had the baby boom after the Second World War. It wasn't just the Second World War, it was the partition of India, it was the revolution in China. All of that results in a baby boom, and so that loop out, original loop out, around about 1950 and a little bit earlier. That then slows, that baby boom, until you get an increase again as the children born after the war begin to have children themselves. That slows, and then you get an increase again as the grandchildren of the children born after the Second World War begin to have children themselves. Then you get a kind of peak baby at 1990, and then the slowing down again. And then what we see happening is that we're never quite going to get up to that level again, and then this drop now. Now, people are absolutely fascinated this year in how many babies are going to be born in 2021, because they wonder what were people doing in 2020. I suspect the deceleration in fertility, the reduction in the number of babies, will actually increase because economic insecurity, not knowing what's going to happen next, you're careful you don't start a family. Life expectancy. Global life expectancy accelerated in the 1950s and 60s as infant health particularly improved, but then you see that rise not increase as much each year from 1966 onwards, but still increasing. We get another acceleration in 1995, probably treatment of AIDS, and then a deceleration. Now, the World Bank suggests this ridiculous kind of acceleration going on next. I think pretty unlikely. I think the gains in life expectancy are and have been slowing down. And generally, since 1966, you can see that that graph moves to the left. So lots of things about us were changing far faster in the times of our parents and our grandparents, and far less now, and probably less in the future, unless the World Bank are correct in their estimate of life expectancy change in future there. Let's just bring you to the present and to Scotland, because the BBC produced this graph. I'm recording this in late January, and they produced a graph for Scotland that I thought was interesting on excess deaths per year since 1860. And the reason for showing you this is not the COVID-19 bar at the end, although that's the one that the graph was produced for, and to show how high excess deaths in 2020 had been in Scotland. It's the years before then. The little spike 5 years before 2020 is 2015. Now notice it's half the size of the 2020 excess deaths. We had huge excess deaths in Scotland in 2015. There were excess deaths in 2016, it rose in 2017, rose in 2018. Smaller but still positive in 2019. And all those little bars before 2020, they all add up to more excess deaths in Scotland than actually happened in COVID. But you don't notice them because it's not a dramatic event, not all in one go. In December 2019, the Institute of Public Policy Research produced a report saying that 131,000 people had died prematurely in the UK because of cuts and austerity. But spread change out over time, and also if you don't think it's going to affect you, much less noticeable, concentrated into a sudden event, and that's what we tend to focus on. But to see the slowdowns, you have to pull out. Here's my last graph, and the Slowdown book ends looking at Japan and looking at Tokyo. And this is a graph, don't try to understand it, you have to believe about it. It's about suburbanization. And is there more growth in the suburbs or the centre of Tokyo? Are the skyscrapers going up or the houses on the edge going up? And what these researchers found is that it oscillated from one to the other until, as you get to more recent years, you get less and less growth, both in the centre and on the edge of Tokyo. And Tokyo is settling in its shape, in its size. Its change is slowing down. Incredible slowdown, incredible acceleration in the past, incredible slowdown now. And the reason I end with this graph of Japan is that this way of drawing graphs actually began in Japan in the 1970s. So I thought it's only fair to acknowledge that. I'm getting almost over time, so just to say thank you very much for persevering with me. In social science, the graphs began in the 1970s in Japan. Of course, in science, people have been drawing these for well over 100 years, and they draw them to look at things like the deceleration of a pendulum, and how that looks in what they call phase space rather than in normal space. My last slide, and a picture of the sandcastles. So I think slowdown is good news. It's not hard, I think, to argue it's good news in terms of our population numbers. Boris Johnson is wrong to talk about the need for world statesmen to talk about bringing in population control. We're doing it ourselves. We are seeing absolutely enormous falls in the number of children that are being born all across the world. There will be a premium on young people in future. But also economic growth slowing down, I don't think is a bad thing. If you think about the carbon dioxide emissions and the temperature rising, we have to slow down economic growth. We cannot have economies certainly producing pollution more and more at the rate in which they were doing. But also slow down in innovation. We've been trained to think that innovations are brilliant. They bring us brand new things, but not necessarily. They're also associated with great turbulence and with war and so on. Slowing down also makes it harder to make large profits in future. And that could alter some of our worst and most selfish behaviour. So I'm optimistic, and it could give us more time to make sandcastles like this, which does take a long time to do. And I'm really looking forward to getting on a beach again to be able to do it. Thank you very, very much for your patience putting up with me, and I hope you've got some challenging and interesting questions to ask me about the idea that we really are at the end of the great acceleration, that it's good for our planet, for our economy and our lives.